G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 7 ahead of the Imola Grand Prix in just under 2 weeks time. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Before we get into everything about Imola, we're going to take a quick look at how the Miami race weekend shook out. Before we get into my team selection, I was actually fortunate enough to attend the race weekend down at South Beach. It was my first time attending the race. Unbelievable experience. And I know historically the race itself hasn't really attracted the best feedback from race viewers and pundits alike in terms of action on track. But I thought not just the action on track, which certainly delivered this year, but also the amenities and the facilities and everything around the track itself was very well put together, despite the fact that some food prices were, from what I could see, pretty exorbitantly priced in GA. I was very fortunate enough to have the opportunity to actually spend Saturday and Sunday with Cash App in their Red Bull suite. So I wanted to just thank them for the hospitality and to experience the race weekend with them in obviously a very welcoming and exciting atmosphere and environment. Really was the icing on the cake for what turned out to be a great result. For Formula One. I think Lando's victory was certainly a shot in the arm for the sport, but for VCUB specifically, Daniel scoring points on the Saturday, Yuki scoring points on the Sunday, a pretty brilliant weekend across the board for the VCUB team too. So again, thank you to Cash App and VCUB for the hospitality, because it was certainly an unbelievable experience. In terms of how my team specifically for F1 Fantasy performed, I had 358 points. Limitless was the chip I chose to use in Miami. It was something that I thought about a great deal heading into the sprint weekend doubleheader in China and Miami. And there was some thought put into whether or not China was the right time. I ultimately saved it for this weekend instead, as did a lot of other people for reasons I've previously mentioned. And it was, on all accounts, a pretty decent result. I was fortunate enough to pick the top 5 scoring drivers and the top 2 scoring constructors. But I think the way Red Bull and Ferrari had performed so far this season made it a pretty straightforward decision for me. That 5th slot, which up until China was probably up in the air a little bit, despite the fact that Lando had scored a podium in Australia earlier in the season, pretty much solidified that place for him in my team in Miami. And he did come into the weekend with a round of upgrades, which Piastri also had half of and will get the second half of at Imola. So I think there was some cause for optimism for Lando specifically. And from what we saw in practice, which was a little bit mixed, went into the sprint expecting at least somewhat of a decent performance. He finished inside the top 10 in sprint qualifying 3, and unfortunately got spun out on the very first turn of the sprint race, which pretty much ruined his day in terms of fantasy scoring. Even though he did come away later in the afternoon with a top 5 qualifying result, that minus 20 in the sprint was pretty tough to stomach. And particularly where there are less points on offer in sprint race weekends, particularly in the sprint race itself, I mean to say, not the sprint race weekend, just for the sprint itself, even though the minus 20 for a DNF is still the same as what you would get in a Grand Prix for if you didn't finish the race, I think it was a pretty harsh penalty for him to be assigned, and hopefully something the F1 developers think about scaling down next year to maybe minus 10 instead, because given there are less points to score on offer, you'd have to think that the DNF penalty is also reduced as a result of that. So that essentially ruined his Saturday in the sprint race. Red Bull and Ferrari, though, otherwise had a pretty good result there. And then fast forward to Sunday, where the 5 drivers on screen qualified in the top 5 as well. I was looking forward to what looked to be a pretty well set up Sunday in the race. And if it wasn't for that DNF from Lando in the sprint race, he would have taken home, anywhere between 20 and 30 extra points for his performance in the Grand Prix. His maiden race win, and deserves all the plaudits as a result of that. It was a very mature drive, and I won't take anything away from the safety car that some people said may have helped him to a certain extent, which I wouldn't disagree with, but the fact he was able to put distance between him and Max and the chasing pack within the first few laps and only extend that as the race wore on demonstrated to me that he's certainly got the the racecraft. He's got the maturity to certainly capitalize on those opportunities when they're presented to him. So I don't think it's going to be the last race we see Lando win in 2024. And if the upgrades are anything to go by, certainly from what we saw in 2023 with McLaren, I definitely think this is a step in the right direction for the Papaya this season as well. Another thing to note is he banked the Driver of the Day award, so an extra 10 points in his pocket there. Back-to-back Driver of the Days after his China result as well. And that's very fascinating to me in particular for a McLaren driver or even a Ferrari driver, because they've taken home 14 of the last 15 Driver of the Day awards, dating all the way back to, I think it was the Dutch Grand Prix when Alonso took that out with a podium there. So it's something just to think about, certainly for your DRS boost if you're not running Max Verstappen, to maybe consider a Ferrari or Lando Norris over Sergio Perez. But I think as well, it just indicates to me that McLaren are on the way up and deserve a bit more consideration in our teams if him and Piastri are able to sustain this kind of performance over, multiple race weekends. And Oscar drove very well until his race was ultimately pretty much curtailed with that run-in with Sainz. So I definitely think they are a team certainly to watch in F1 fantasy circles. Now, in terms of the chip itself, I won't spend too much more time on my race weekend performance, but I think something to think about was how my team stacked up between China and Miami. And a lot of people ran the Limitless chip in China and others ran it in Miami. I obviously went for the latter of the two, but my second team, which I kind of run as a test team for F1 Fantasy, for this season, run what alternate strategy I would have otherwise gone with if it wasn't for the strategy I ultimately choose for my team one. And that decision for my team two was the Limitless in China, and then run a non-Limitless team in Miami. And you can see here the point split across the two race weekends. As I've pointed out, the Limitless chip didn't pay off quite as much as it did in China, with an extra 100 points difference. But obviously then you can see here that's offset from the non-max, the non-limitless lineups. Even though I did use no negative in China, it just wasn't quite enough over 2 weekends. And everyone that did use limitless in China, it was a risk, but a risk that certainly paid off. And I'm not going to take anything away from those of you that successfully used it. So yeah, I'm 25 points down on the decision. I'd still happily live with the decision given the information I had at the time. But it just goes to show that, certain outcomes are certainly going to play a big factor in what your rank is and what your total points are over, a short window of time or over the entire season as well for that matter. But notwithstanding that, still a very big green arrow from 19K up to 5.7 in the world. We'll still certainly push for more throughout the season. I still think it's very early, so if your rank's a little bit further down, don't stress too much. There's still plenty of weekends ahead to deploy chips and give thought to when the best times are to use those. So yeah, all in all, a pretty decent weekend, but I think for Imola in particular, it's going to be probably less exciting as it's not a sprint race weekend, and for many of us, there's only going to be 2 transfers available to use. So we'll take a look at what my team was before I activated the Limitless. And if you didn't catch what I mentioned about this chip in my previous videos, whenever you activate Limitless, your team will reset to the team you had before activating the chip, and the budget increases or decreases will be assigned to those pre-Limitless drivers and constructors. So this is my team that I had in China, and the only blemish on that was Logan Sargent's DNF. Not by any means the end of the world. I knew his luck was bound to run out at some point, having not had a DNF up until Miami. So this is essentially what I have, and unless we see maybe rain, I couldn't see me thinking about using another chip, maybe autopilot, to hedge against that. But Max himself is an exceptional wet weather driver. So I definitely think I'll be carrying one transfer into the following race. It could just be a pretty uneventful one for me, but I've obviously talked about Ferrari in particular and McLaren driver of the day candidacy there. The other thing to note is that Ferrari are also bringing a big package of upgrades to Imola. And there's a lot of expectation that they're going to propel them up to where Red Bull is, maybe even a bit ahead of them. But I guess we'll have to wait and see what those 3 practice sessions unveil for us on the Friday and the Saturday. I'm pretty content with what this team is at the moment. I just love the consistency and reliability of Max as my 2X, and I'm not taking anything away from Leclerc, Perez, Sainz. They've all driven very well themselves this season. But I think Max, just that base, you kind of know what you're going to get from him every week. Minimum 30 points more often than not. He's always going to be on the podium. And that DNF in Australia was a red herring. So I definitely think this is something I'll probably just sit tight on for now until I see pre-practice and make decisions from there. But I think for me, my budget's not so great at the moment. Albon's my most expensive tier C or C tier budget driver. So I only have so much I can do. And I did mention I only will likely use one trade if I run this lineup in Imola. So that gets me any driver from Kevin Magnussen and below. And I'm very much considering running a Haas driver or even Pierre Gasly. Alpine's upgrades and the improved car performance generally since the start of the season is on the up. I'm not suggesting they're going to be podium sitters anytime soon, but Ocon's point in Miami, and I think Gasly's and Ocon's just improved consistent performances from where they were at the start of the season, kind of laboring around P18, P19, P20 to kind of just on the fringe of the points, makes me think there's something there for them in the next few weeks if they can continue that upward trajectory. Haas, I've talked about quite a bit. I just love the improved race pace from them. Of the 2 drivers at Haas, up until this weekend or the last couple weekends, I was more of a Kevin Magnussen fan than a Hülkenberg fan. K-Mag typically doesn't seem to get out of Q2 at all, sometimes even goes out in Q1. And so in terms of F1 fantasy, you want those cheaper drivers starting further back because of the extra overtakes, positions gained you get. Hülkenberg, on the other hand, tends to make it into Q3 pretty frequently, so it means he's got to hold station most of the time, won't make that many positions gains, but with that race pace, you'd think he's probably got a few overtakes in his bag. The fact, though, that K-Mag was essentially using his car as a battering ram through Miami, and the fact that he's almost playing the team game to protect Hülkenberg, let him score the points, and Magnussen essentially shoulder any kind of penalty points, whatever it might be, just makes me think they're using him as the scapegoat for Haas to score points for Nico. So if K-Mag essentially is that torpedo to defend for his teammate, then I worry he could put himself in a few more situations where he's colliding with other drivers. We saw him hit Sargent on Sunday, and the fact that there are quite a few close calls with Lewis Hamilton on the Saturday in the sprint race too makes me think it's probably a risk I'm not so willing to take right now. I'd much rather go for the safe bet in Nico Hülkenberg. So I could certainly go for that. There's also the option to move to a Pierre Gasly for Alpine. I think they're on the up. But if I don't choose to get rid of Albon, the only other option I really have is Zhou, and that would only open the door for Hülkenberg. So it could be something like an Albon Hülkenberg or a Magnussen Zhou or a Gasly Zhou or a Hülkenberg Zhou. Williams by no means is looking super encouraging, and Logan Sargent doesn't fill me with any confidence because of his DNF on the weekend. I wouldn't put it past him if it happens to him again sometime soon. So that's one such option. If I went a no max build, if I just bring Zhou back in here, then the most logical route for me would most likely be Ferrari. I think Charles Leclerc, he's looked very good so far. Big fan of his podium in Miami. And I wouldn't say the gulf between him and Sainz is that major. I just much prefer Leclerc, even though Sainz has won more races lately. But I think Leclerc, Sainz, if you're constrained on budget, Sainz makes for an exceptional alternative. And then in place of that, I'd have enough to upgrade Sargent to someone like Lance Stroll, potentially. Now, Stroll's obviously also had that DNF in the sprint race weekend in Miami, and doesn't have a great record of consistency. The one thing in his favor is that he still is in a car that, at this point in time, I think is the 5th best car on the grid. I think VCarb are making strides forward, but I don't think they're quite yet there to challenge the Aston Martin. And Stroll, if he can just keep it on track, he's usually good for a few overtakes. in a car that's much stronger than the rest of the midfield, which is usually who he's jousting with. So I think I like that for Stroll. He's more often than not got budget increases in him as well. So if we just go over to F1 Fantasy Tools, we filter by price changes per race, go down to Lance Stroll. You know, he has DNF twice, but when he hasn't DNF'd, he's good for 0.5 or in Australia's case, a $1 million increase. So we know he's got the budget potential if he can at least finish the race. I just don't know if that consistency is there forever. And we know there's an extra recession of risk with DNFs on the sprint weekends, but maybe if he can just hold the car in one spot, get it to the end of the race, then a $0.5 million increase is certainly very achievable compared to the rest of the midfield and the back markers. So I think for me, that could certainly be another alternative to my team for Imola, but I'll cover all of that off in more detail in my race week preview and final thoughts closer to the deadline. I think I'll park it there for now, guys, given there's still a lot of subjectivity around what teams could look like with upgrades and all that news heading into Imola as we kickstart our European journey for the races in the middle stanza of the season. But be sure to let me know down in the comments if your strategy to your team heading into these non-sprint weekends is going to change at all. But I think that'll be it for now, guys. As always, I appreciate you dropping by. As I also said last week, thank you again for 4,000 subscribers. It's really something that excites me, and I'm really looking forward to creating more content for you. So thanks to all of you that have engaged with this content over the last couple of years. But I appreciate you guys dropping by, and I'll see you all very soon.